Yeah, Kevin.
Oh yeah, is there any desert?
Up here or back there? It looks like that's used. Up here if you want. Yeah,
I can switch some seats.
you can switch. Thank you.
Yeah. Or for real, you can keep your seat, bro, and I can move over there.
Or it doesn't matter. Whatever. All right. So there's a French writer who wrote about this, and when we talk about like kind of rebirth, what is being reborn in that sense? And what's being reborn is the classical learning, particularly the emphasis on Greek and Roman culture. So when we're talking about the Dark Ages, the early Middle Ages, I talked about a guy named Petrarch who lived roughly around this time, who was the first one to coin that term Dark Ages. He was referring to in that era as such because him as being what we talked about as a humanist, somebody who's like kind of now aware of things like Aristotle and Plato and all the great works of the Greeks and Romans and stuff. The people that right after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, they lost that information. They lost that. They were living in a dark age. They're forced to. Now, of course, that's a very simplification of things, if you will, but it was a way to kind of separate, for Petrarch, a way to kind of separate those who are kind of cultured from those who are basically kind of emerging out of a great era to become uncultured to a certain extent. And then the term Renaissance is referred to in other areas. Like we talked about Charlemagne. I talked about historians like to refer to that era of Charlemagne as the Carolingian Renaissance, where the kind of like the Frankish Empire kind of transcended one that was just kind of made of Germanic customs and cultures to one that was kind of again like kind of like European and kind of close to unified. U.S. history, I'm sure you guys talked about the Harlem Renaissance, which was kind of a rebirth in kind of things like like literature, like music and like kind of entrepreneurship and stuff like that. All right. So that's a term that has become used for other things in other areas of people. Now, historians believe that the Renaissance itself starts, of course, in Italy, and particularly northern Italy. All right. And so why northern Italy? All right. Well, one reason is that northern Italy was highly urbanized. And by urbanization, I mean we see a sizable number of like cities with high population. All right. That's one of the things that we talked about, that kind of the difference between early and high Middle Ages is the increase in population and people moving back into cities. Now, a lot of these populations take a hit, of course, because of the Black Death, like in certain cases, like 50% of these populations. But prior to that, you have populations like places like Siena, Milan, Genoa, and Venice, which kind of came to dominate the Mediterranean trade routes from the Crusades, and Florence, all with populations either around or near 100,000. All right. Also, to this area, which for a long period of time was part of the Holy Roman Empire, right? In chapter 9, I talked about something called the Battle of Lugano, which occurred in the 12th century. At Lugano, we see a kind of a collection of these city-states together called the Lombard League. So sometimes they refer to this area as Lombardy. And they basically kind of unified, and they defeated the forces of Frederick Barbarossa. And that was one of the first battles where we see like kind of like those who were like kind of a cavalry defeated by mainly kind of men at arms. That gave a lot of these city-states autonomy, basically the right to kind of pick and choose their own style of governments. Right? And so some of these governments were actually pretty progressive into a certain sense. All right. So this is the map of kind of like in northern Italy at this time. Now, what you have in the south, you have a traditional kingdom that's a kingdom of Naples. Here are the papal states with Rome, the papacy at the center. But all of these are kind of their own independent states with their own style of government. Sometimes they would fight amongst each other. All right. But some of them shared certain common traits where we see like some of them were we would classify as republics, where they would kind of elect officials. Now, not everybody could vote, and only certain people could hold office, but this is a little different than your traditional kind of monarchy, if you will. Right? And in a lot of these cities, we see basically the kind of what we talked about, the bourgeoisie, the burger class, all right, the middle class, those who kind of make money in the traditional sense of producing things and such, come to dominate not just basically kind of financially, but politically as well. All right, and a lot of these guys, and some of them are like they're going to come out of a lot of those guilds, like those merchant guilds, like a big guild like in Florence was the cloth guild, the wool guild. All right. And so they're going to become the leaders of, like, for example, in Florence, which is considered the birthplace, like the epicenter of the Renaissance. You see, like, kind of something called the Signoria, which was essentially the kind of city government. It was like their assembly there. Almost all of that was kind of made up of people who were kind of parts of, kind of like, at least the influential ones of these various merchant guilds. All right. So Venice had a republic. Milan had a kind of traditional kind of like landed aristocracy, like a duke and stuff like that, but he still had an influence on a lot of these guys. So in other parts of like, we talk about England and France with the establishment of the modern parliament and the Estates General, they would use these kind of middle class, these merchants, as counterweights against the kind of influence of nobles and clergy. In northern Italy, these were the ones who were calling the shots for the most part, right? And so we have a number of families that come to dominate. Like you have like in Milan, the Sforza, you have the Borgias, and then and other groups. In Florence, the emergence of the Medici, which are probably the family that's most kind of aligned with the Renaissance, they start to come to power in the 1300s. Right? The Medici are going to be the big patrons of the arts. All the Ninja Turtles that we'll talk about next week at some point financially benefited from Medici patrons. Right? The Medici established a bank. So last chapter I was talking about the Great Schism. Right, that split between the Catholic Church, where we have the papacy in France, and then we have the papacy at Rome. There's two popes going on. At the very end, there's actually three popes. There was two popes that came out of Pisa. The last of those was a guy named John the 23rd. His real name was John Belisario. He was basically just a priest. However, he was bankrolled by the Medici, by Giovanni and his son Cosimo. Right, and so when John essentially steps down at the Council of Constance, the Medici stay on as the Pope's bankers. That is going to give them obviously a lot of wealth and also a lot of cachet, a lot of kind of clout, if you will. All right. So later, Cosimo is going to use that wealth to parlay it into political power, and he's going to become the head of Signoria. All right. And the Medici are going to come to kind of almost while they get elected to things, it almost becomes almost a hereditary role here. All right. And so this is the kind of the cameo of Cosimo. Now I don't need to type this out, pending Alzheimer's, but the Medici, one of the things as the Pope's bankers, they were responsible for collecting tithing, which basically everybody was supposed to give like 10% of your income to the church. Also, too, they started to develop like kind of franchises, like they would kind of have banks in other parts of Italy, but also outside of Italy. And they developed a kind of limited liability concept. So they would try to like kind of stay away from sketchy loans, in particular from particular nobles, particularly when nobles are trying to generate an army and stuff. Right? So those types of nobles tended to not pay their debts back. So they kind of stay away from that. Now, their connections, because of the Pope's bankers, there was a number of Medici that became popes. All right, actually, there's four in all, but two at this era were Clement VII and Pope Leo X. Now, they're cousins. Their fathers were brothers. They were the grandsons of Cosimo de' Medici. Clement VII was the illegitimate son of Giuliano de' Medici, and Leo was the son of Lorenzo, who is known in history as Lorenzo the Magnificent. He's probably, of the Medici, probably the strongest Medici. He's going to be basically the one who funds Michelangelo and Botticelli and stuff like that. Right? Leo is a prime example of, like I said, there's a little bit of nepotism here. He becomes a cardinal because of who his father is. All right? He's 13 when he becomes a cardinal, right? Which is incredibly young. Right? When he becomes pope, when he's elected pope, this is when we have the kind of the beginnings of the Reformation occur. All right. So Martin Luther would look at some of the corruption, and other popes before them were corrupt. There was one pope who was a Borgia, who would publicly, he had a wife that was acknowledged, he had 3 kids. One of his sons becomes a cardinal. The other son killed his sister's husband in broad daylight in Rome. All right. He even was acknowledged he had a mistress. All right. So a lot of these popes, they would tell like priests to basically stay celibate. They weren't doing that. When Leo was elected, they had a big parade, all right, and in both Florence and in Rome. And in one story, there was like both parades. They had a bunch of these young boys that were naked, painted in gold paint, issuing a new golden age. One of the kids died from the paint. He was also given a pet elephant from the King of Portugal named Hannah, a white elephant, mind you. All right. Now, when I drive in the parking lot, I see major players because major players do what they want. Haters stay on silence and do what they can. I see you guys pushing in your whips, rolling on 26s. I myself rolling 18s, but I keep them clean. All right. But riding on a white elephant, that's stung. All right. So we ride around Rome every once in a while on a white elephant. There was actually an attempt on his life. He suffered from what's called a fistula, which is like kind of he was basically bleeding out his rear end. So there was an attempt where they were going to poison his bandages. That was uncovered before it could happen, and 2 cardinals were basically implemented in that. All right. So when Luther, who we'll talks about how the church is basically just concerned about material things, Leo was a pretty kind of easy target for them. So Leo, he excommunicates Luther, all right, and that's the beginning of the Lutheran Church and other Protestant churches, all right. Now he is succeeded not directly, but later by his cousin Clement. Clement is later going to father an illegitimate child himself with an African slave girl who becomes Alessandro de' Medici. Later, when the Medici come back, because they're going to be kicked out of power a few times, when they come back, they put Alessandro in power as Duke of Florence. He is the first person of color who is a noble in Europe. All right. Clement is also going to be at the center of the issue with Henry VIII when he tries to get a divorce. The problem is that Clement is basically he's aligned with and kind of under house arrest by Catherine Henry's wife's nephew, Charles V. So, like I said, a lot of these families kind of incestuous here. All right. That's Clement on the left, and that's Leo on the right. Both of these were painted by the Ninja Turtle Renaissance artist Raphael. All right. Now, also what the Medici are going to do is to use their power and wealth to try to beautify the city. So what they would do is they would have these competitions for artistic endeavors that were kind of the purpose of for like civic responsibility. One of the first competitions that they had was the rebuilding of the doors of the baptistry of the Cathedral of Florence. Every major cathedral had a separate building for baptisms. All right, and so the cathedral there, essentially what the Medici did was they basically kind of like held a competition. Somebody was awarded a contract. It basically gave them a lot of cachet, but it also was pretty financially nice little windfall. The guy who's going to win out is a guy named Lorenzo Ghiberti. All right, Ghiberti's a goldsmith. He's a merchant, has his own shop. He's like a master craftsman, if you will. The deal is that he opened up his shop to the public, and it was the public who was voting for this. All right. And so what ends up happening is he spent, like I said, about 50 years. He himself spent close to about 20 years. It's his his artisans at his shop that spent a little bit more time like kind of refurbishing and stuff like that. These doors, I'm going to show them to you. You're not going to be impressed because it's 2021. It's just like what it is. But they're revolutionary at the time because they created 3 dimensions. This is where we're starting to get where art goes from 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional. All right, and later Michelangelo referred to what they refer to today as the gates of paradise. All right, so this is the baptistry. All right, in Florence. Those are the doors right there. All right. And so this is what we're talking about when we kind of see they're kind of like 3-dimensional. These are all panels. They're all scenes from the Bible. All right. So at the time when people saw this, they were completely blown away by it. All right. Like this is the kind of the story of kind of Jesus at the Temple Mount there. All right. And so they're like again kind of transcending. You're not going to be that impressed with it, but at the time people were pretty impressed. All right. Over time though, because of industrialization and pollution and stuff like that, they've been really kind of like taxed. So they are not these are not the ones that are on right now are not the original doors. They took the original doors. They're in a museum in Florence. They're trying to restore them. When I was there in 2011, I took this picture. Like there's like a gate in front of there. I got stuck my phone through there. And for whatever reason, I think with my camera, the kind of like the wood panel there kind of appeared blue. But you can see like kind of like the kind of from the side the kind of 3 dimensions that are kind of created from that. All right. So, like I said, the ones that are up right now are replicas. When I go to places, I like to point at things, all right, to prove that I was there. So, later when I got the picture back, I had the person who took the picture shown to me. I wasn't unaware that guy was in my frame. So he was just kind of walked around the corner there. I kind of walked up, grabbed his backpack, all right, took it off him, and I hit him with it like 3 times. All right, now. If you guys see me out doing tourist stuff and I'm pointing at stuff, getting a picture taken, don't get in my frame because you're catching hands. That's just how it is. All right? Because I'm not against beating down an Italian or a Frenchman or whatever. Because particularly when I'm traveling abroad, I'm chewing gum, talking loud because I'm proud to be an American. Free. All right? So just now, later. The Medici speaking to another content here. This time it's for the cathedral itself. The deal is that when the cathedral was built, it wasn't fully completed. The problem was it doesn't have a roof on a good section of it. All right, so the area where there was supposed to be a dome, the guy died before it could be completed, and he had all the elements ready. So, well, that's not coming in. So the Medici decided that they're going to hold a competition for this. All right. The guy that eventually wins out is Filippo Brunelleschi. Now, Brunelleschi was actually up for the contract for the doors of the baptistry. He lost to Ghiberti, and apparently he was pretty upset by it. He split Florence. He ended up in Rome with his friend and Ninja Turtle and future Renaissance artist Donatello. Right? While Donatello was in Rome observing kind of statues and sculptures, Brunelleschi was observing structures, ancient structures. One thing he became particularly fascinated by was the Pantheon, which was built during the time of the Emperor Hadrian and particularly itself. So when he returns to Florence, it was roughly around the same time they're having this competition. Initially, he was awarded this contract with Ghiberti. And the story was that he was pretty petty. And so what he decided to do was essentially kind of sabotage it. So one day he called in sick, all right, didn't come to the work site. Then the afternoon, he miraculously kind of appears and observes what's going on and criticizes Ghiberti in front of the workers. Word gets back to the Signori and the Medici in particular. They remove Ghiberti from the job and Brunelleschi gets it. All right. Now, Brunelleschi is considered by many accounts to be really the first true architect. All right. While he doesn't like have blueprints per se, he kind of etches stuff. All right. And this is going to be kind of revolutionary when it comes to architecture. I'm going to play this short little video here from National Geographic that talks about, and this is referred to as the Duomo. All right. The church is called St. Mary of the Flower. All right. And so this is, like I said, this is an important kind of structure when it comes to
It's 1418 in Florence, Italy. You've been challenged to build a great dome for the Santa Maria del Fiore, one of the grandest cathedrals ever built. And you have no formal architectural training. No pressure, right? For Filippo Brunelleschi, a goldsmith and clockmaker, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. He considered the challenge carefully. Then proposed a daring plan using methods that experts don't fully understand even to this day. At the time, domes were often built as semicircles. But the town fathers required that Brunelleschi build an 8-sided dome that would be even taller and stronger. It would also have no central support system to hold it up during construction. Even worse, the dome's base was an imprecise octagon with no true center. But Brunelleschi had that covered. There would be 2 domes instead of one, an inner and an outer shell, held together by giant brick arches and interlocking rings of stone and wood. The rings would work like hoops on a barrel, keeping the dome from expanding outward. To move heavy loads hundreds of feet up, Brunelleschi designed ingenious new machines, including an ox-driven hoist and massive lifting devices far ahead of time. So, revolutionary design? Check. Groundbreaking engineering? Check. Can-do attitude? Check. But with no central support system, how would he actually build it? First off, the masonry would have to support itself during construction. To do this, Brunelleschi placed the bricks in an herringbone pattern, which spiraled to the top of the dome, with vertical bricks acting as bookends to hold the others in place. They laid about 1 roll a week, giving the mortar time to cure. At this rate, the dome grew at a snail's pace of about a foot a month. But perhaps most puzzling is how he was able to place the bricks with such precision.
Hey.
Many experts agree that he used guide ropes. One theory states that ropes ran from a flower pattern on the work platform that showed exactly where the bricks should go. Another has ropes running from the dome's center, tracing a series of cones that grew smaller as they ascended to the top. Still another suggests a different arrangement of central ropes and wooden templates. However it was done, it worked. The 8 faces of the dome met at the top precisely, just as Brunelleschi had planned. In all, it took 16 years to complete the dome. When he died in 1446, Brunelleschi left behind no sketches and no details as to exactly how he achieved his masterpiece. Today, it remains the largest masonry dome in the world, more than 500 years after it was built. Imagine.
So this is what it looks like today. All right, and you can see here from this aerial view how tightly compact Florence is, over the years of just basically building up. So here you have the baptistry itself, right here. All right, and then this is the tower, the clock that was built by Giotto, or designed by Giotto, who I'll talk about next week. And there's the dome. This is the first kind of self-sustaining kind of like dome structure built in Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. All right. So there's certain things that he did that was kind of revolutionary. Like one, just simply getting materials up there. All right. So traditionally, when you had like kind of levers and like like hoists and stuff like that, cranes. But what there was normally what it was, you have two oxen at the bottom, and they would walk in circles, and the crane would the hoist would go up. The problem is to get it back down, you'd have to switch the oxen's direction. So you'd have to take off their kind of harness, and then now you have them walk the opposite direction. That was very time consuming. So what he developed was something called the ox hoist, which is kind of like a lever system. So basically the ox could walk in the same direction, so that it would go up, and you would have it like kind of like it was like a peg. And then you take the peg out and you put it into another kind of peg right next to it, and then that would switch it so it could come back down. All right, so that saves a whole lot of time. He even like watered down the wine that the workers would have at lunchtime, because I don't know if you know anything about Italians; they're fond of wine. You know what wine is? It's a beverage that's made of grapes, and people drink it. For a lot of moms drink it, and they talk about it's Wine Wednesday. And so he also kind of developed because this is self-sustaining. It's basically two domes within a dome within a dome. So that whole herringbone pattern here. So the bricks kind of sustain themselves. So you have two kind of horizontal bricks, and then you'd have a vertical brick. Horizontal, vertical, horizontal, vertical. So it would displace the weight a bit. All right, like when we talk about the Hagia Sophia, collapsed in on itself before it was completed. All right, this has not collapsed in. All right. Also, he developed something that is important not just for architecture, but for art in itself, the concept of linear perspective and the idea of a vanishing point. So the story was, before he kind of started searching, he stood outside here right at the doors of the cathedral. And he looked at, I'm going to go back. He looked at the baptistry. All right. And so what he did was he had a sketching of the baptistry. All right. And then he poked a hole through it. All right, and had a mirror right behind that. So he was getting a direct reflection of the baptistry. And so what he was getting from this was this idea that kind of like this kind of linear perspective is that you have these parallel lines that eventually at some point they vanish. They kind of merge into one. What this does, it allows you to get this idea of a sense of three dimension. So before you build it, you can almost get a kind of idea that this is kind of constructing in itself. All right, this is going to be important for art. All right, so like those of you, I'm fascinated by anybody who creates stuff like this. And there's some really great artists here that I like recently, they put up some displays here. Anybody who is in construction, like I'm fascinated. I'm not good at that stuff. So anybody who could look at something and go, I'm going to build even like a deck, like they have that idea. That's something that's almost inherently in somebody who's like artistic. All right, that wasn't always the case. All right, so Brunelleschi is the one who's kind of credited with that. So perspective is going to be important. We'll talk about next week when we talk about Da Vinci and all this other stuff. A lot of this is credited to Brunelleschi. This is again. So anytime anybody talks about Florence, this is like the arch of St. Louis. All right, it's the Duomo there. And then also the Medici are going to be influential in inspiring probably the most famous. Oh, and this is like I said, inside there. It's a dome within the dome. So there's a fresco paintings. They were initially painted by Vasari, who was a great painter. In some ways more famous as a writer. He wrote a lot about Michelangelo and Leonardo. So a lot of information we get about those guys comes from Vasari. But the Medici are also going to inspire the probably most famous kind of like Triste or kind of booklet on political governance called The Prince. Now the guy who wrote that is Niccolo Machiavelli. All right. Next, on Monday, I'm going to give you guys an assignment. I'm going to give you an excerpt from The Prince. Probably the most famous excerpt is chapter 17, where Machiavelli asks the question, is that as a leader, is it better to be loved or to be feared? All right. Now, initially, like when we talk about somebody being Machiavellian, we get this idea that there's somebody who's conniving and scheming. All right. And politics is kind of full of that. What Machiavelli was basically advocating was that you need to maintain the power by any means necessary. If that means lie, cheat, or steal, then do it. However, he himself, who had served in the Florentine government, there was no evidence that he was like that. Matter of fact, he was basically in the Florentine government when the Medici were out of power. When the Medici returned, he was on the wrong side, and he was that side. All right, and so he's basically writing this as almost a satirical, almost jaded kind of view of what politics is. Now, I know we're done with notes here. On Monday, the last question I'm gonna have you guys is basically a little short answer question for me. Basically, do you agree with his approach to power and why? And then give me an example of somebody who's Machiavelli. So what I'm gonna do here, I know we're almost done. I'm just gonna play this video and talk about what it means to be Machiavelli to give you kind of a little bit of insight here. All right.
From Shakespeare's plays to modern TV dramas, the unscrupulous schemer for whom the ends always justify the means has become a familiar character type we love to hate. So familiar, in fact, that for centuries we've had a single word to describe such characters: Machiavellian. But is it possible that we've been using that word wrong this whole time? The early 16th century statesman Niccolo Machiavelli wrote many works of history, philosophy, and drama, but his lasting notoriety comes from a brief political essay known as The Prince, framed as advice to current and future monarchs. Machiavelli wasn't the first to do this. In fact, there was an entire tradition of works known as mirrors for princes, going back to antiquity. But unlike his predecessors, Machiavelli didn't try to describe an ideal government or exhort his audience to rule justly and virtuously. Instead, he focused on the question of power, how to acquire it, and how to keep it. And in the decades after it was published, The Prince gained a diabolical reputation. During the European wars of religion, both Catholics and Protestants blamed Machiavelli for inspiring acts of violence and tyranny committed by their opponents. By the end of the century, Shakespeare was using Machiavel to denote an amoral opportunist, leading directly to our popular use of Machiavellian as a synonym for manipulative villainy. At first glance, The Prince's reputation as a manual for tyranny seems well-deserved. Throughout, Machiavelli appears entirely unconcerned with morality, except insofar as it's helpful or harmful to maintaining power. For instance, princes are told to consider all the atrocities necessary to seize power and to commit them in a single stroke to ensure future stability. Attacking neighboring territories and oppressing religious minorities are mentioned as effective ways of occupying the public. Regarding a prince's personal behavior, Machiavelli advises keeping up the appearance of virtues such as honesty or generosity, but being ready to abandon them as soon as one's interests are threatened. Most famously, he notes that for a ruler, it is much safer to be feared than loved. The tract even ends with an appeal to Lorenzo de' Medici, the recently installed ruler of Florence, urging him to unite the fragmented city-states of Italy under his rule. Many have justified Machiavelli as motivated by unsentimental realism and a desire for peace in an Italy torn by internal and external conflict. According to this view, Machiavelli was the first to understand a difficult truth: the greater good of political stability is worth whatever unsavory tactics are needed to attain it. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin suggested that rather than being amoral, the prince harkens back to ancient Greek morality, placing the glory of the state above the Christian ideal of individual salvation. But what we know about Machiavelli might not fit this picture. The author had served in his native Florence for 14 years as a diplomat, staunchly defending its elected republican government against would-be monarchs. When the Medici family seized power, he not only lost his position, but was even tortured and banished. With this in mind, it's possible to read the pamphlet he wrote from exile, not as a defense of princely rule, but a scathing description of how it operates. Indeed, Enlightenment figures, like Spinoza, saw it as warning free citizens of the various ways in which they can be subjugated by aspiring rulers. In fact, both readings might be true. Machiavelli may have written a manual for tyrannical rulers, but by sharing it, he also revealed the cards to those who would be ruled. In doing so, he revolutionized political philosophy.
I just want to thank you students here. Alan Hoff, Anna Deacon, Molly Smith, Jameson Drake, and William Green. Thank you for performing for seniors over the lunch hours. You sounded great, so everybody should check out Electric Baby Powder if you want to listen to some good music there. So that was fun. Thank you for doing it. Also, just a reminder to all of our students, Monday is a normal Monday with regard to checking your Google Classroom. And then Tuesday and Wednesday, our juniors will be taking part in standardized testing. So you won't have any outside school assignments, but freshmen, sophomores, and seniors should be catching up on any makeup work, completing assignments, working ahead on projects, or you can do a college day or job shadow, so take advantage of that time, and then we look forward to seeing you back in person on Thursday. So have a great weekend, everybody. Be safe, and you'll get this in due time here. Thank you.
Taking a week off.
All right, so on the assignment, like I said, the last, but like the first 9 questions is basically the article and try to go over and to read. The last one is basically you're gonna tell me whether you agree with Machiavelli's approach to power and why. Don't just give me yes or no, and then give me an example of somebody who would kind of fit that kind of model. Now, I've had people that have give obviously politicians that are like that, but I've had people give fictional characters. Even somebody wrote about a teacher here who they remain nameless, although their last name starts with an N, and they have a glorious mother. So, that part is where the clock goes. So if you don't do it, and you get paid. You get paid. Yeah. Yeah. But any kids apparently class, they get real long, kind of they go like, oh, that's kind of funny. Yeah, it was more humorous. Yeah.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.